Hello everyone. Welcome to Realist Quill. Like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching now? Lock your doors. Check under your beds. And whatever you do, don't trust the night manage. My name is Alex, and I'm sharing this story as a warning to anyone who thinks they know their neighbors. Sometimes the most ordinary people harbor the darkest secrets, and I learned this lesson the hard way during my first year of graduate school. After finishing my bachelor's degree, I decided to pursue a master's in architecture at a university about 3 hours from my hometown. The program was prestigious but expensive, and like many grad students, I was on a tight budget. The university housing was completely full, and most of the apartments near campus were way out of my price range. After weeks of desperate searching, I finally found a small house for rent in a quiet neighborhood about 2 miles from campus. The house was nothing special, a tiny 2-bedroom with outdated appliances and questionable plumbing. But the rent was reasonable, and I could bike to class. The landlord seemed nice enough, an older man named Mr. Davenport who lived a few streets over. He explained that the previous tenant had moved out unexpectedly, which was why the place was available mid-semester. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just relieved to have found somewhere to live. The neighborhood was mostly older folks who'd lived there for decades, with a few young families scattered throughout. My house was sandwiched between 2 other small properties. On the left lived a young couple with a newborn who I rarely saw or heard from. On the right was an older man who introduced himself as Walter Jenkins when I moved in. Walter was probably in his late 60s, tall and lanky with thinning gray hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes. He had this permanent squint, like he was always looking into bright sunlight. He seemed friendly enough, offering to help me unload my car and bringing over a container of homemade chili that first evening. He told me he was retired from the local paper mill and had lived in the house for over 30 years. "You need anything at all, you just let old Walter know," he said with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'm usually up at all hours anyway, never been much of a sleeper." The first few weeks were uneventful. I settled into my routine of classes, studying, and the occasional social outing with classmates. Walter would wave whenever he saw me leaving or returning home, sometimes stopping to chat about the weather or ask how my studies were going. He seemed to know a lot about the university despite never having attended, and would occasionally mention professors by name or reference campus buildings that had been renovated or renamed over the years. It was early October when I first noticed something strange. I had stayed up late working on a project and was heading to bed around 2 a.m. when I glanced out my bedroom window, which faced Walter's backyard. Even though it was the middle of the night, Walter was outside in his garden digging. He had a headlamp on and was methodically turning over soil in a patch near his fence line. I thought it was odd, but figured maybe he couldn't sleep and decided to do some gardening. Some older people have trouble sleeping. A few nights later, I noticed him again, this time planting something. It struck me as strange to be planting in October, but I reminded myself that some plants did better when planted in fall. Still, something about the way he moved, so deliberate, so careful, made me uneasy. I closed my blinds and tried to forget about it.
The following week, I was walking home from a late study session at the library when I saw Walter's truck pulling into his driveway. It was after midnight, and he had something large wrapped in a tarp in the truck bed. He quickly covered it with another tarp when he noticed me walking by. He gave me a friendly wave but seemed tense. "Late night, Alex?" he called out, his voice a little higher than usual. "Yeah, midterms," I replied, trying to keep things casual. "What about you?" "Just picking up some supplies for my garden," he said, patting the tarp. "Got a good deal on some fertilizer." I nodded and hurried inside my house. Locking the door behind me, something felt off, but I couldn't quite place it. Who buys fertilizer at midnight, and why did it need to be covered so carefully? Over the next few days, I found myself watching Walter's house more often. His behavior seemed to follow a pattern. He'd leave in his truck every few days, always after dark, and return a few hours later with something covered in his truck bed. Then, in the early morning hours, he'd be in his garden, digging and planting. I mentioned it casually to my landlord during a routine visit to fix my leaky faucet. "Oh, Walter's always been into gardening," Mr. Davenport said dismissively. "Been doing it for years. Kind of odd about it." "Sure, but harmless. His vegetables won ribbons at the county fair back in the day." That should have reassured me, but something still felt wrong. I decided to look more closely at Walter's garden the next time I had a chance. The opportunity came sooner than expected when Walter knocked on my door one afternoon and asked if I'd mind feeding his cat while he visited his sister for the weekend. "She had a fall," he explained, looking genuinely concerned. "Nothing serious, but I should be there. It's just for 2 nights." I agreed, of course. Despite my unease, I had no real reason to say no, and he'd been nothing but kind to me. He gave me his spare key and showed me where the cat food was kept. His house was immaculately clean and organized, with dated furniture that looked barely used. The walls were covered in old photographs, many showing a younger Walter with who I assumed was his wife and children, though he'd never mentioned family other than his sister. "The cat's name is Mittens," he said, though I hadn't seen any sign of a cat yet. "She's shy with strangers, so don't worry if you don't see her. Just leave the food out and she'll eat when she feels comfortable." Walter left early the next morning. That evening, I went over to feed the mysterious Mittens as promised. I put out fresh food and water but saw no sign of a cat. No hair, no litter box, nothing. I wondered briefly if Walter had made up the cat as an excuse to get me into his house, but that seemed paranoid even to me. Before leaving, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced out his back window at the garden. In the fading light, I could see that it was meticulously maintained, with neat rows and clearly defined sections. What struck me as odd was that there didn't seem to be any actual vegetables or flowers growing, just carefully tended soil with small markers sticking out of the ground, almost like tiny headstones. I decided to take a closer look. I justified it to myself. Walter had given me permission to be in his house, and the garden was visible from my window anyway. I stepped outside and approached the garden. The markers were small wooden stakes with numbers written on them. The most recent one, near where I'd seen him digging the other night, was marked 37. As I stood there trying to make sense of it, my foot struck something partially buried. I crouched down and brushed away some soil to reveal what looked like a small metal box. My heart raced as I dug it out. It was a tin about the size of a deck of cards, rusted around the edges but intact. The rational part of my brain told me to put it back, that I was violating Walter's privacy, but curiosity won out. I opened the box.
Inside was a woman's silver bracelet, tarnished with age, and a driver's license. The license belonged to a woman named Patricia Hartman, and according to the issue date, it was about 15 years old. I quickly closed the box and reburied it, my hands shaking. It could be innocuous. Maybe Walter found these items and was keeping them safe. Or maybe they belonged to his wife, but combined with his midnight gardening and the numbered markers, something felt very wrong. I went back inside my house and locked all the doors and windows. Then I did something I'm not proud of. I searched for information about Walter online. There wasn't much, but I did find his name mentioned in a few old newspaper articles about community events. Nothing suspicious. Then I searched for Patricia Hartman. The results made my blood run cold. Patricia had been reported missing 15 years ago after leaving work at a diner just outside town. Her car was found at a rest stop on the highway, but she was never located. The article included a photo, and I recognized her face from one of the pictures in Walter's house. The woman I had assumed was his wife. I spent the night jumping at every sound, convinced Walter would somehow know I'd discovered his secret. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked about Walter's wife, trying to sound casual. "Walter? He never married," Mr. Davenport said. "Always been a bachelor as far as I know. Why do you ask?" I mumbled something about a photo I'd seen, and we moved on to other topics. But inside I was panicking. If the woman in the photos wasn't his wife, who was she? And why did he have her bracelet and ID buried in his garden? I debated calling the police, but hesitated. What exactly would I tell them? That my neighbor gardened at night, and I'd trespassed and found a box with some old ID in it. It wasn't exactly compelling evidence of wrongdoing. Besides, Walter had lived here for decades and was well regarded in the community. Would anyone even believe me? I decided to do a bit more digging. Figuratively. This time, I spent hours that day researching missing persons cases in the area, going back 30 years. What I found disturbed me deeply. There had been at least 6 unsolved disappearances of women within a 50-mile radius during that time. All were young to middle-aged women who had vanished without a trace, most last seen at night or in the early morning hours. That evening, I returned to Walter's to feed the still unseen cat. This time, I paid closer attention to the photographs on his wall. In several of them, Walter posed with different women in various settings. A park, a restaurant, what appeared to be a carnival. In each photo, Walter looked the same age as in the others, suggesting they were taken around the same time period. But the women were all different. None of the photos looked like typical couple shots. They seemed more like photos taken with casual acquaintances or coworkers, yet they were displayed prominently, like family photos would be. I counted the photographs. There were 36 in total, the same as the number of markers in his garden, minus the newest one. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I needed to get out of there immediately. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A door in the hallway that I hadn't noticed before, partly hidden behind a bookshelf. It was locked with a padlock. Who puts a padlock on an interior door? I heard a car in the driveway and froze in terror. Through the front window, I could see Walter's truck pulling in. He wasn't supposed to be back until tomorrow. I hurried out the back door, making sure to lock it behind me, and rushed through the side yard to my own house, praying he hadn't seen me. Once safely inside, I called the police. I knew how it would sound, but I couldn't ignore my suspicions anymore. The dispatcher seemed skeptical but said they'd send an officer to take my statement. I spent the next hour pacing my living room, jumping every time I heard a sound outside. When the officer finally arrived, I told him everything: the midnight gardening, the numbered markers, the box with Patricia Hartman's belongings, the photos that corresponded to the number of markers, and the locked room. He took notes but didn't seem particularly alarmed. "I'll look into it," he said in a tone that suggested he was humoring me. "But Mr. Jenkins has been a respected member of this community for decades. He volunteers at the hospital and donates to the police fund every year. I've known him personally for over 15 years." I felt deflated but insisted they at least question him about Patricia Hartman. The officer said he would follow up and left. I watched from my window as he walked next door and knocked on Walter's door. They spoke briefly on the porch, both glancing in my direction at one point. The conversation seemed friendly, with Walter smiling and gesturing animatedly. After about 5 minutes, the officer left without entering the house. I received a call from the officer the next day. He explained that Walter had provided a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. The midnight gardening was due to his insomnia and the fact that he was growing rare night-blooming plants that required specific care. The numbered markers were simply his cataloging system. As for Patricia Hartman, Walter claimed she was an old friend who had given him her bracelet as a keepsake before moving to Arizona. He kept her ID because she had left it behind and he'd always meant to mail it to her but lost touch. "We checked, and there is a Patricia Hartman registered in Tucson," the officer told me. "As for the locked room, Mr. Jenkins says that's where he keeps his valuable collection of antique gardening tools. He offered to show it to me, but I didn't feel it was necessary to invade his privacy further." I was stunned. Either Walter had managed to concoct an elaborate cover story on the spot, or I had let my imagination run wild and falsely accused an innocent man. The officer assured me that they would verify the information about Patricia Hartman, but he didn't expect to find anything suspicious. I spent the next few days avoiding Walter as much as possible. When we did cross paths, he was as friendly as ever, never mentioning my call to the police. That made me even more uneasy. Wouldn't an innocent person be upset about such accusation? About a week later, I came home from class to find Walter in his front yard, waiting for me. He smiled and waved me over. My instinct was to rush inside, but I didn't want to be rude in case I really had misjudged him. I cautiously approached. "Alex, I wanted to talk to you about what happened," he said, his voice gentle. "The officer told me about your concerns, and I understand how things might have looked suspicious from your perspective." I stammered an apology, feeling guilty despite my lingering doubts. "No need to apologize," Walter said, waving it off. "I'd like to clear the air. Would you join me for dinner tonight? I can explain everything properly, and you can see there's nothing sinister going on." Every instinct told me to decline, but part of me wanted answers, wanted to be reassured that I wasn't living next door to a murderer. Plus, refusing might make things awkward since we were neighbors. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "What time? How about 7? I make a mean pot roast." I agreed and spent the next few hours debating whether to go. In the end, I decided I would, but I took precautions. I texted my location and Walter's address to my best friend, with instructions to call the police if she didn't hear from me by. I also kept my phone in my pocket with emergency services on speed dial. Walter's house was warm and inviting when I arrived. The smell of pot roast and fresh bread filled the air, and he had set the table with nice dishes and candles. It seemed like he was making a real effort to make me comfortable. During dinner, Walter explained that he understood how his behavior might have seemed odd. The night gardening was indeed because of his insomnia, but also because he was growing plants for a university research project on nocturnal species. He showed me documentation from the botany department, confirming his volunteer status. The numbered markers were for tracking different plant varieties and their growth rates. As for the photographs, Walter explained that he had worked as a freelance photographer for many years, and the women were subjects from various assignments. He kept the photos because he was proud of his work. He even showed me a few old photography magazines that featured his work. "And the locked room?" I asked, still not entirely convinced. Walter hesitated, then sighed. "It's not gardening tools. It's my late mother's room. I've kept it exactly as it was when she passed 20 years ago. It's difficult for me to go in there, but I also can't bear to change it. The lock is to remind me not to enter impulsively. It's not healthy, I know, but we all have our ways of dealing with grief." His explanation was so honest and vulnerable that I felt terrible for suspecting him. We finished dinner on a lighter note, talking about my studies and his gardening projects. By the time I left, I was almost completely reassured that my suspicions had been unfounded. Almost. That night, I woke to the sound of digging. I crept to my window and saw Walter in his garden again, headlamp on, digging a new hole. This wasn't unusual based on what he'd told me about his nocturnal plants, but as I watched, he retrieved something from beside him, a small box similar to the one I'd found. He placed it carefully in the hole and covered it up, then put in a new marker. Even from my window I could see the number 30. The next day, I contacted the local police station again, and asked about the verification of Patricia Hartman in Tucson. The officer I spoke with seemed confused and said he wasn't aware of any such investigation. When I mentioned the officer who had responded to my call, he informed me that no one by that name worked at their department. My blood ran cold. I described the officer who had come to my house, and the person I was speaking with said it sounded like retired Chief Larson, who had been Walter's best friend for decades. He no longer had any official capacity with the department. I was about to share my suspicions when the officer cut me off, saying he had to go but would call me back. He never did. That evening I was preparing to leave. I had decided to stay with a classmate until I could figure out what to do when there was a knock at my door. It was Walter, holding a container of leftovers from our dinner. "Thought you might enjoy these for lunch tomorrow," he said, smiling. "I always make too much." I thanked him awkwardly and was about to close the door when he said, "By the way, I noticed you watching me from your window last night. If you're interested in my night gardening, you're welcome to join me sometime. I could use the help, especially with planting the newer specimen." His eyes held mine for a moment too long, and I knew then that he was aware of everything. My suspicions, my call to the real police, probably even my plans to leave. The message was clear. He was watching me as much as I was watching him. "Thanks, but I've got a busy week ahead," I managed to say. Walter nodded, still smiling. "Another time then. Oh, and Alex, I think you dropped something in my garden during your last visit." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a keychain. My keychain, with the university logo that I thought was safely in my bag. "Must have fallen out of your pocket when you were examining my plant markers," he continued, his voice still pleasant but his eyes cold. "You really should be more careful. It's easy to lose things. People lose things all the time and never find them again." He placed the keychain in my hand, his fingers lingering a moment too long. Then he turned and walked back to his house, whistling quietly. I didn't wait until morning. I threw my essential belongings into my car and drove straight to the police station in the next town over. This time they took my statements seriously and promised to investigate. They advised me not to return to the house until they had completed their inquiry. 3 days later, I received a call from a detective. They had obtained a warrant to search Walter's property based on my statement and the connection to Patricia Hartman. What they found beneath those numbered markers wasn't plants. It was small boxes containing personal items, jewelry, IDs, credit cards, even locks of hair. 38 boxes, 38 victims. The locked room in Walter's house wasn't his mother's preserved bedroom. It was a meticulously organized trophy room with photographs, newspaper clippings, and personal items from each victim displayed on the walls. Walter had been abducting and murdering women for over 30 years, keeping their belongings as souvenirs and documenting his crimes like entries in a gardening journal. The officer who had initially responded to my call was indeed former Chief Larson, who had been covering for Walter for years. Both men are now in custody, facing multiple charges of murder, obstruction of justice, and more. I never returned to that house. The university helped me find emergency housing, and I'm in therapy now, trying to process everything that happened. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear the sound of digging outside my window. The most terrifying part, the detective told me they found a small wooden box on Walter's bedside table, empty except for a slip of paper with my name written on it, and the number. I never believed in monsters until I moved into apartment 2B at Oakwood Heights. Now I know that monsters are real, and sometimes they live right above you. My name is Maya, and until last year, I was a typical 26-year-old, trying to make it in the city. After a painful breakup left me both heartbroken and homeless, I was desperate to find an affordable place quickly. When I spotted the listing for a one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood at a price that seemed too good to be true, I jumped on it immediately. The building was older, but well-maintained, with charming details like crown molding and hardwood floors. The landlord, Mr. Chen, was an elderly man who lived on the first floor and managed the 4-unit building himself. "It's a quiet building," he assured me during the showing. "The tenant above you works nights, so he sleeps during the day. You'll hardly know he's there." That sounded perfect to me. I worked from home as a graphic designer, and the last thing I needed was noisy neighbors disrupting my concentration. I signed the lease that day and moved in the following weekend. The first few weeks were blissful. The apartment was everything I had hoped for. Spacious, full of natural light, and blessedly quiet. I settled into a comfortable routine, working during the day and exploring my new neighborhood in the evenings. Mr. Chen had been right about the upstairs neighbor. I rarely heard any noise from apartment 3. In fact, I hadn't seen my upstairs neighbor at all, which was a bit unusual in such a small building. I had met the couple who lived across from me in 2A, and the young woman who lived in 3A often stopped to chat when we crossed paths in the lobby. But 3B remained a mystery. "Oh, that's just Mr. Tanner," Mr. Chen explained when I asked about him one day while collecting my mail. "He's been here longer than any of us. Nearly 20 years now. Keeps to himself. Works the night shift at the hospital." "As an orderly?" I asked, trying to picture my enigmatic neighbor. Mr. Chen shook his head. I believe he works in the morgue. Actually, not a job many people want, but someone has to do it. That explanation satisfied my curiosity at the time. It made sense that someone who worked with the dead all night might prefer solitude during their off hours. I mentally filed Mr. Tanner away as just another eccentric city dweller and went about my business. It was about 2 months after I moved in when I first heard the sound. I was working late one night, trying to finish a project before deadline, when a strange noise came from the ceiling above me. It was a slow, rhythmic scraping, like furniture being dragged across the floor. I glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Wasn't Mr. Tanner supposed to be at work? The scraping continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. I waited, listening intently, but the apartment above remained silent for the rest of the night. I chalked it up to Mr. Tanner having a night off and rearranging his furniture, though the timing seemed odd. A few nights later, I heard it again. This time, the scraping was accompanied by a heavy thudding, like something solid hitting the floor repeatedly. It lasted longer this time, nearly 20 minutes before silence fell again. I considered going upstairs to check if everything was okay, but decided against it. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't want to bother him over what was probably nothing. The sounds became more frequent after that, always between sometimes it was just the scraping, other times it included thuds, bumps, and what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I began to dread the 3 a.m. hour, finding myself tensing up as it approached, waiting for the noises to begin. My work started to suffer as my sleep became increasingly disturbed. Dark circles formed under my eyes, and I found myself jumping at small sounds. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to speak to Mr. Chen about the situation. Mr. Tanner works nights, he repeated when I described the noises. He shouldn't even be home at those hours. Maybe he changed shifts? I suggested. All I know is that someone or something is making noise up there almost every night. Mr. Chen looked troubled. I'll speak with him when I see him, he promised. Perhaps he has a guest staying with him. I thanked him and went back to my apartment, feeling slightly better having reported the issue. That night, however, the noises were worse than ever. The scraping started right on cue at 3:12. But this time it was accompanied by what sounded like whispers, faint, indistinct murmuring that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out words, just a continuous, unsettling hum of multiple voices speaking in hushed tones. I recorded the sounds on my phone and played them back the next morning. The scraping and thuds were clearly audible, but the whispers were lost, reduced to static-like background noise. Still, it was evidence that I wasn't imagining things. That afternoon, I ran into the woman from 3A in the lobby. Her name was Jess, a nurse who worked at the same hospital where Miss Tanner supposedly worked. I casually brought him up in conversation. Oh, the guy in 3B. I've only seen him a handful of times in the 2 years I've lived here, Jess said, checking her mailbox. Weird guy, super pale, always looks like he hasn't slept in days. Does he work at your hospital? I asked. Mr. Chen mentioned something about the morgue. Jess furrowed her brow. The morgue? No, that can't be right. I know all the morgue attendants, there's only 3 of them and none of them are named Tanner. Are you sure that's what Mr. Chen said? A chill ran through me. Maybe I misunderstood, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. Or maybe he works at a different hospital. Maybe, Jess agreed. But she looked skeptical. There's something off about him though. The few times I've run into him, it's always been super early in the morning when I'm coming home from night shift. He never says hello, just stares. And he always has these large duffel bags with him. My unease deepened. Duffel bags? Yeah. Big one, like body bags. Almost, she laughed. Then stopped when she saw my expression. Sorry, hospital humor, you get desensitized after a while. But seriously, they're just gym bags or something. Probably nothing weird. We parted ways, but Jess's words stayed with me. If Mr. Tanner didn't work at the hospital morgue, Where did he go every night, and what was in those duffel bags? That night, the noises started earlier. Around 2 a.m., the scraping was louder, more frantic, and the whispers had evolved into what sounded like muffled conversation. I pressed my ear to the ceiling, trying to make out words, but it was impossible. What really disturbed me, though, was a new sound. A wet, squelching noise like something moist being handled or manipulated. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on a robe over my pajamas and marched upstairs, determined to confront Mr. Tanner directly. Standing outside 3B, I hesitated. The hallway was silent. I couldn't hear any of the noises that were so clear in my apartment below. Had they stopped, or was the sound somehow not carrying into the hallway? I knocked firmly. No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I was about to knock a third time when I noticed something seeping from under the door. A dark liquid, forming a small puddle on the hallway floor. I crouched down and touched it gingerly. It was thick and sticky, with a metallic smell that I recognized immediately as blood. Heart pounding, I ran downstairs to Mr. Chen's apartment and banged on his door. It took several minutes for him to answer, bleary-eyed and confused. "There's blood coming from under Mr. Tanner's door," I gasped. "I think something's happened to..." Mr. Chen's face went pale. He grabbed his master key and followed me upstairs. The puddle had grown larger in the few minutes I'd been gone. "Mr. Tanner?" Mr. Chen called, knocking loudly. "Are you all right? We're coming in." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The smell hit us immediately. A sickening combination of decay, chemicals, and something I couldn't identify. Mr. Chen gagged, covering his mouth with his hand. I was frozen in the doorway, unable to process what I was seeing. The apartment was essentially one large workspace. Plastic sheets covered every surface, including the furniture. Large work tables dominated the center of the room, with various tools laid out neatly. Scalpels, saws, needles, thread. A row of industrial refrigerators lined one wall, all secured with heavy padlocks. The source of the blood was a large cooler that had tipped over near the door, its contents partially spilled onto the floor. Packages wrapped in butcher paper, leaking dark fluid. But what truly horrified me were the photographs covering every inch of wall space. Hundreds of them, showing people, men, women, children in various states of dismemberment. Some were clearly dead, their eyes vacant, skin waxy. Others appeared to be alive when the photos were taken, eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. "Oh my God," I whispered, backing away. "Call the police, now." Mr. Chen was already fumbling for his phone when we heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy footsteps, accompanied by the sound of something being dragged. We turned to see a tall, gaunt man ascending the final step. He was dressed in scrubs stained with dark splotches, and he was pulling a large duffel bag behind him. When he saw us standing outside his open apartment door, he stopped. "Mr. Tanner?" Mr. Chen's voice was barely audible. The man's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "You shouldn't have come in," he said softly. "No one is supposed to see my work until it's finished." He dropped the duffel bag and reached into his pocket, pulling out what looked like a surgical scalpel. In that moment, several things happened at once. Chen shoved me toward the stairs, yelling at me to run. Jess emerged from her apartment across the hall, alarmed by the commotion, and Mr. Tanner lunged forward, slashing the air where I had been standing a second before. I stumbled down the stairs, Jess right behind me. We heard Mr. Chen cry out in pain, followed by a heavy thud. Tanner's footsteps thundered after us as we reached the lobby and burst through the front door onto the street. "My car," Jess shouted, pointing to a small sedan parked across the street. We sprinted toward it, but I could hear Tanner gaining on us. Just as we reached the car, I felt a sharp pain across my back. He had caught up and slashed at me with the scalpel. Jess screamed and fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the doors. We dove in, and she locked the doors just as Tanner slammed against the driver's side window. His face contorted with rage. Jess started the car and peeled away from the curb, tires screeching. In the rearview mirror, I could see Tanner standing in the middle of the street, watching us drive away. He didn't chase us or try to follow. He simply stood there, a dark silhouette growing smaller as we sped away. We drove straight to the police station. The cut on my back wasn't deep, more of a surface wound, but it was evidence of assault. The police took our statements and dispatched units to the apartment building immediately. They found Mr. Chen unconscious, but alive at the top of the stairs, with a serious head wound. There was no sign of Tanner. The investigation that followed revealed the full horror of what had been happening in apartment 3B. Richard Tanner was not a hospital employee but a self-taught amateur anatomist with a pathological fascination with the human body. For nearly 2 decades, he had been abducting people, mostly homeless individuals or others unlikely to be immediately missed, and conducting gruesome experiments in his makeshift laboratory. The refrigerators contained preserved body parts meticulously labeled and cataloged. His computer held thousands of photographs and detailed journals describing his work. He had soundproofed the floors and walls of the apartment except for directly above my bedroom. Whether by oversight or deliberate design, we'll never know. Most disturbing of all was his ultimate goal revealed in his journal entries. Tanner believed he was perfecting a technique to create composite humans, improved beings made from the best parts of multiple individuals. He described himself as a modern Frankenstein, but with a purer vision than the fictional doctor. The police launched a massive manhunt, but Tanner seemed to have vanished without a trace. They found evidence that he had been planning to leave for some time: fake IDs, foreign currency, and multiple prepaid phones. Whichever identity he was using now, he could be anywhere in the world. That was 6 months ago. I've since moved to a new city and started therapy to deal with the trauma. Mr. Chen recovered from his injuries and sold the building, unable to continue living there after what happened. Jess and I still keep in touch, bonded by our shared experience. I thought I was starting to heal, to put the nightmare behind me. Then last week I received a package at my new address, an address that no one except my closest family and my therapist should know. Inside was a small jar containing what the police later confirmed was a preserved human ear, along with a handwritten note. "I've been listening to you, Maya. I'll see you soon. We have unfinished work to do." They've increased police patrols in my neighborhood and installed a security system in my apartment. But it doesn't help me sleep at night. Every sound from upstairs makes me freeze in terror. Every scrape, every thud, every whisper. Because I know he's out there somewhere, watching, wait, and one day when I least expect it, I'll hear that familiar sound from upstairs again. I should have known something was wrong with Mrs. Blackwood's garden from the first day we moved in, but I was too excited about our new house to notice the warning signs. Now 3 years later, I'm the only one left to tell the story of what happened to my family, and I still don't know if anyone will believe me. My name is Daniel Harrison, and when I was 14, my parents bought what we thought was our dream home. A charming 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet suburban neighborhood with good schools and friendly neighbors. At least, most of them seemed friendly. The exception was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, an elderly woman who lived alone in a Victorian house that seemed too large and too old for the rest of the neighborhood. The realtor had mentioned that Mrs. Blackwood was eccentric but harmless, and my parents took that to mean she was just a quirky old lady who kept to herself. We tried to introduce ourselves on moving day, but no one answered when we knocked, despite the lights being on inside. My mother left a plate of homemade cookies on the porch with a welcome note from us to her, ironically enough. The plate was returned the next day, washed and empty, with no note in return. What really caught my attention about Mrs. Blackwood's property wasn't the house itself, but the garden that took up most of her backyard. It was unlike any garden I'd ever seen, not the neat rows of vegetables or decorative flower beds that other neighbors had, but a wild, almost jungle-like growth of plants I couldn't identify. Tall, twisted stalks with dark purple leaves, bushes with glossy black berries, flowers that seemed to shift color depending on the angle of the light. and at the center an enormous tree with smooth, pale bark and no leaves at all, despite it being the middle of summer. The garden was surrounded by a high wrought iron fence with pointed spikes along the top, and the gate was secured with multiple locks. Signs reading "Private" and "Keep Out" were posted every few feet along the perimeter. It felt less like a garden and more like a high-security facility for plants. I finally saw Mrs. Blackwood about a week after we moved in. I was in my bedroom, which faced her property, when I noticed movement in her garden. She was a small woman, hunched with age, with long white hair that hung loose down her back. She wore a faded floral dress that seemed to belong to another era and gardening gloves that came up to her elbow. What struck me most was how she moved, not with the slow, careful steps you'd expect from someone her age, but with quick, almost spider-like movements as she darted between plants. I watched as she carefully collected what looked like seed pods from one of the purple-leaved plants, placing them in a small cloth bag at her waist. Then she moved to the leafless tree and, using a small silver knife, made an incision in the bark. A thick, milky substance oozed out, which she collected in a glass vial. The whole process was methodical, precise, like a scientist conducting an experiment rather than an old woman tending her garden. As if sensing she was being observed, she suddenly looked up, directly at my window. Even from that distance I could see her eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, and fixed on me with an intensity that made me step back from the window. She raised one gloved hand and pointed at me, then drew her finger across her throat in a slashing motion. I ducked away from the window, heart pounding. Had she just threatened me? When I gathered the courage to look again a few minutes later, she was gone, but the garden seemed to have shifted somehow, the plants leaning slightly in the direction of our house as if they too were watching. I told my parents about the encounter, but they dismissed it. "She was probably just telling you not to spy on her," my father said. "You should respect people's privacy, Daniel." My mother was slightly more concerned, but still not alarmed. "Maybe we should invite her over for dinner," she suggested. "It might help break the ice." That weekend, my parents sent me next door with a formal dinner invitation. I approached Mrs. Blackwood's front door with dread, half hoping she wouldn't answer. The house was even more imposing up close. The paint peeling, the windows dirty, the porch sagging slightly on one side. I knocked, waited, and was about to leave the invitation tucked in the door when it creaked open a few inches. Mrs. Blackwood peered out at me through the crack. Her pale eyes narrowed. "What do you want, boy?" Her voice was surprisingly strong, with an accent I couldn't place. I held out the invitation, my hand trembling slightly. "My parents would like to invite you to dinner tomorrow night, if you're available." She took the card from me, examining it as if it might be contaminated. "The Harris." She looked back at me, her gaze traveling from my head to my feet. "You're the one who watches me. The curious one." I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to spy." A smile spread across her face, revealing teeth that were too white and too even for a woman her age. "Curiosity is not a sin, boy, but it can be dangerous if not properly directed." She tapped the invitation against her palm. "I will come to your dinner. 7 o'clock. Yes?" I nodded, and she closed the door without another word. As I walked back home, I noticed something strange. My shadow on the ground seemed darker than it should have been, almost solid, and it appeared to lag slightly behind my movements, as if reluctant to follow me away from Mrs. Blackwood's house. The next evening, precisely at 7, Mrs. Blackwood arrived at our door. She had transformed herself from the wild gardener I had seen to a perfectly presentable elderly neighbor. Her white hair was neatly styled, and she wore a conservative blue dress with a cameo brooch at the collar. She brought a gift, a small potted plant with delicate white flowers. "Peace lilies," she explained, handing the pot to my mother. "They purify the air. Every home should have one." My mother thanked her and set the plant on our dining room sideboard. Throughout dinner, Mrs. Blackwood was charming and articulate, telling stories about the neighborhood's history and asking polite questions about our family. She seemed particularly interested in my younger sister Emma, who was 9 at the time. "Such a lovely child," she commented, watching Emma intently. "So full of life and potential." The compliment should have been innocent enough, but something in her tone made my skin crawl. I noticed that Mrs. Blackwood barely touched her food, moving it around her plate to give the impression of eating without actually consuming anything. As the evening progressed, my parents warmed to her, clearly charmed by her old-world manners and extensive knowledge of local history. I remained wary, especially when she mentioned her garden. "It's a very special collection," she told us. "Some of the specimens are quite rare, plants with unique properties that modern science has forgotten or ignored." "Are they medicinal?" my father asked. Mrs. Blackwood's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Some heal, some harm, some transform. It depends on the intention and the recipient." She turned to Emma. "Perhaps you would like to see my garden sometime, dear. Children often have a natural affinity for growing things." Before Emma could answer, I cut in. "Your garden looked pretty dangerous. All those keep-out signs." "Daniel," my mother admonished, but Miss Blackwood waved off her concern. "The boy is right to be cautious. My garden is not for the unprepared. It requires respect." She fixed those pale eyes on me again. "Some plants respond to fear. They can sense it, like animals can, and they react accordingly." After that unsettling pronouncement, the conversation moved to safer topics, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired. When Mrs. Blackwood left around 9, she clasped each of our hands in turn. Her skin was dry and cool, like old paper, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said at the door. "It's been a long time since I shared a meal with a family." She glanced back at the peace lily on the sideboard. "Take good care of my gift. Water it only at night, and it will thrive." That night, I had trouble sleeping. My room felt too warm, the air thick and hard to breathe. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Blackwood's garden. The plants growing taller and taller, their roots breaking through the fence, creeping across the lawn toward our house like questing fingers. In the dream, the leafless tree at the center of the garden had a face, a twisted human-like visage embedded in its trunk, eyes closed as if sleeping. As I watched, the eyes slowly opened, revealing the same pale blue as Mrs. Blackwood's. I woke gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My room was filled with a sweet, cloying scent that seemed to be coming from downstairs. I crept out of bed and followed the smell to the dining room, where the peace lily sat on the sideboard. In the moonlight streaming through the windows, I could see that the plant had changed. The flowers, which had been closed buds earlier, were now fully open and much larger than they had been, their white petals luminous in the dark. The scent emanated from them, growing stronger as I approached. Something made me stop a few feet away from the plant, a primitive instinct perhaps, warning me not to get too close. As I stood there, debating whether to wake my parents, I saw one of the flowers slowly turn toward me as if tracking my movement. It was subtle, I might have imagined it, but I was certain the plant was reacting to my presence. I backed away and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. In the morning, the peace lily looked normal again, its flowers modestly sized and partially closed. When I mentioned the incident to my parents, they exchanged concerned glances. "You were probably sleepwalking," my father suggested. "Or maybe just had a vivid dream." My mother was more sympathetic but equally dismissive. "Plants don't move that quickly, honey. It's physically impossible." I dropped the subject, but I started paying closer attention to the peace lily and to Mrs. Blackwood. Over the next few weeks, I noticed several disturbing patterns. The plant did indeed grow more active at night. I set up my tablet to record time-lapse video of it, and captured footage of the flowers opening wider after dark, the stems elongating by several inches before retracting at dawn. More worryingly, I noticed small tendrils extending from the base of the pot, probing along the surface of the sideboard like blind worms. As for Mrs. Blackwood, she had become a regular visitor to our home, often dropping by unannounced to bring small gifts, homemade jams and jellies made from fruits in her garden. herbal teas that she claimed would help my father's occasional insomnia, a special lotion for my mother's arthritis. My parents were delighted with these offerings, especially as they seemed to work remarkably well. Dad started sleeping through the night for the first time in years, and Mom reported that her joint pain had all but disappeared. The only person who hadn't received a special gift was me. Mrs. Blackwood was unfailingly polite when we interacted, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between us, a mutual recognition that I was watching her as carefully as she was watching me. Emma, on the other hand, had become Mrs. Blackwood's special favorite. The old woman often invited my sister to her house for tea or to help with simple gardening tasks, always in the front yard, never behind the wrought iron fence that enclosed the main garden. Emma would return from these visits, full of stories about Mrs. Blackwood's fascinating house, filled with treasures from all over the world, and the special cookies that tasted like flowers and made her feel floaty and happy. I tried to warn my parents that something wasn't right, that Miss Blackwood was taking an unhealthy interest in Emma, but they accused me of being jealous and overdramatic. She's a lonely old woman who never had children of her own, my mother said. It's natural that she'd enjoy spending time with Emma, and it's good for Emma to learn to respect her elder. My concerns grew when Emma started to change. It began with small things. She became quieter, more introspective, spending hours staring out the window at Mrs. Blackwood's garden. Then physical changes appeared. Her normally rosy complexion became pale, almost translucent, and there was a faint green tinge to her fingernails. She complained of being cold all the time and took to wearing sweaters even on warm days. Most alarming was her sudden fascination with plants. She began collecting specimens from around the neighborhood, pressing them between book pages, and hanging bundles of dried herbs from her bedroom ceiling. One afternoon, I followed Emma to Mrs. Blackwood's house without her knowledge. I watched from behind a neighbor's hedge as they sat on the front porch, drinking tea from delicate china cups. Mrs. Blackwood was speaking intently, her hands moving in elaborate gestures, while Emma nodded solemnly. Then Mrs. Blackwood took something from her pocket, a small vial of what looked like the same milky substance I had seen her collecting from the leafless tree. She added a drop to Emma's tea, and my sister drank it without hesitation. I confronted Emma that evening in her room. "What did Mrs. Blackwood give you to drink today?" My sister looked up from the book she was reading, an ancient-looking tome that I'd never seen before, with faded illustrations of plants. "Just tea," she said, her voice oddly flat. "She put something in it." I saw her. Emma's expression didn't change. "It's medicine. It's helping me become what I'm supposed to be." "What does that mean? What are you supposed to be?" She smiled then, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, which had always been hazel but now looked more green than brown. "Something better. Something that will live forever." She returned to her book, clearly done with the conversation. I went straight to my parents, insisting that Mrs. Blackwood was drugging Emma and that we needed to keep them apart. This time, my father became angry. "That's a serious accusation, Daniel. Miss Blackwood has been nothing but kind to this family. Emma is just going through a phase. You remember what it was like to be 9 and discover a new interest. But her fingernails are turning green," I protested, "and her eyes are changing color." My mother sighed. "I think you're letting your imagination run wild. Emma is fine. She's just a little pale from spending too much time indoors reading. If anything, her friendship with Mrs. Blackwood has been good for her. She's more focused, more mature." I realized I wasn't going to convince them, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I needed evidence of what Mrs. Blackwood was doing, and the only place I was likely to find it was in her forbidden garden. The next night I waited until everyone was asleep. The peace lily on the sideboard had grown considerably over the past few weeks. Its pot now contained what looked like multiple plants, their stems intertwined, the flowers as large as dinner plates. As I passed it on my way out, I could have sworn I heard a faint sighing sound, like a breath being exhaled. Mrs. Blackwood's house was dark, which I took as a good sign. Armed with a flashlight and my phone to take pictures, I made my way to the wrought iron fence surrounding her garden. The locks on the gate were complex, 3 different padlocks, and what looked like a custom mechanism, but I had no intention of trying to open it. Instead, I had found a section of fence where a large bush on the outside provided cover, allowing me to climb over unobserved. The garden at night was even more unsettling than it was during the day. The strange plants seemed to pulse with a life of their own, some emitting a faint bioluminescence that cast eerie shadows. The air was thick with competing scents, sweet, bitter, earthy, metallic, and the ground beneath my feet felt spongy and unstable, as if I were walking on something alive. I made my way carefully toward the center of the garden, where the leafless tree stood. Up close, it was even more disturbing than it had appeared from my window. The bark was indeed smooth, with a texture more like skin than wood, and it was warm to the touch. The trunk was gnarled in places, forming shapes that disturbingly resembled human features. A nose here, a mouth there, a hint of fingers pressing outward as if trapped inside the tree. I took several photos, the flash illuminating details I wished I hadn't seen. Then I noticed something at the base of the tree, a circular depression filled with dark soil, about the size of a child. Next to it was a small wooden box. I crouched down and opened it, finding it full of vials containing the milky tree sap, along with dried herbs, small bones that looked disturbingly human, and a leather-bound journal. I opened the journal to a random page and shone my flashlight on the text. It was handwritten in faded ink, the script ornate and difficult to decipher, but I could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of recipe or procedure. The heading read, "The grafting of human and flora," and the text below detailed a process of preparing a human subject, preferably young. It specified through a regimen of teas and tinctures made from specific plants in the garden. The final stage involved a planting in which the prepared subject would be merged with the mother tree, becoming one with the eternal garden. My blood ran cold as I realized what Mrs. Blackwood was planning for Emma. I quickly took photos of several pages of the journal, then replaced it in the box. I needed to get out of the garden and show this evidence to my parents immediately. As I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something hanging from a low branch of a nearby shrub. A small cloth doll that looked crudely homemade but disturbingly familiar. I moved closer and felt my heart stop. The doll had been made to resemble me down to the color of my hair and the clothes I was currently wearing. A small knife had been stuck through where the heart would be. Before I could process this discovery, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. Soft footsteps on the spongy ground, coming toward me from the direction of the house. I quickly turned off my flashlight and ducked behind the mother tree, hoping its massive trunk would hide me. "I know you're here, Daniel," Mrs. Blackwood's voice called out, sounding amused rather than angry. "The garden told me we had a visitor. It can sense your fear. It finds it delicious." I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as her footsteps came close. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" she continued. "The garden and I are one. Every leaf, every root, is an extension of my consciousness, just as Emma will soon be." She was on the other side of the tree now. I pressed myself against the trunk, praying she wouldn't circle around to my side. "Your sister has such potential, so receptive to the old ways, so ready to transcend her limited human form." Her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried clearly to my hiding place. "Not like you. You resist, you question. I had hoped you might come around, but now I see that you need to be pruned." Something brushed against my ankle, and I looked down to see a vine wrapping itself around my leg, moving with deliberate purpose. I stifled a scream and kicked at it, trying to free myself, but more vines emerged from the ground, reaching for my limbs. "Don't fight it," Mrs. Blackwood said, suddenly right behind me. "The garden will only squeeze tighter." I whirled around to face her. In the dim light of the garden's bioluminescent plants, she looked barely human. Her white hair seemed to move on its own, like tentacles, and her skin had the same texture as the mother tree's bark. Her eyes glowed with an internal light, the pale blue now vivid and unnatural. "What are you?" I gasped, still struggling against the vines that were now reaching my knees. She smiled, revealing teeth that had become sharp and green-tinged. "I am the garden, and the garden is me. I have lived many lives, worn many human skins, but my essence remains unchanged. I am older than this town, older than the concept of gardens themselves. I was worshipped once. Did you know? People brought me offerings, animals at first, then their own children when the harvest failed." As she spoke, more vines emerged from the ground, some wrapping around my arms, others creeping up my back. I could feel them tightening, slowly restricting my movement. Times changed. People forgot the old ways. They built houses and roads over sacred groves, drove back the wild places. I had to adapt, to hide, to pretend to be one of them. She gestured at herself. "This body is just a vessel, one of many I've inhabited over the centuries. It grows old, despite the garden's nourishment. I need a new caretaker, someone young who can tend to the garden for the next generation." "Your sister is perfect. She's just a child," I protested. My voice strained as the vines constricted around my chest. "Children learn quickly, and they believe easily. Emma already loves the garden. Soon she will become part of it, and I will teach her everything I know." Mrs. Blackwood reached out a gnarled hand to stroke my cheek. Her touch was cold and rough, like tree bark. "You, however, are a problem. Too stubborn, too wedded to the modern world. But don't worry, nothing is wasted in my garden. Your body will nourish the roots, and perhaps a small part of your consciousness will remain, aware as you're slowly absorbed over decades. Isn't that a kind of immortality?" The vines had reached my neck now, making it difficult to breathe. I struggled to reach my pocket where my phone was stored. If I could just get to it, call for help. Mrs. Blackwood noticed my movement and laughed. "No one will hear you, Daniel. No one will believe you. Your parents are already under the garden's influence. The peace lily sees to that. Every breath they take in that house fills their lungs with spores that make them susceptible to suggestion. They'll believe whatever I tell them about your disappearance." My fingers closed around my phone, and with my last bit of strength, I pulled it out and pressed the emergency call button. Mrs. Blackwood hissed in anger and lunged for the phone, but it was already dialing. The sound of the ringtone cut through the night air. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. The vines tightened suddenly, cutting off my air. As darkness crept in at the edges of my vision, I heard sirens in the distance, not responding to my call, which had barely connected, but to another emergency. Later, I learned that it was my house. It had caught fire, the blaze apparently starting in the dining room, where the peace lily sat. The distraction was enough for Mrs. Blackwood's concentration to falter. The vines loosened slightly, and I managed to break free, gasping for air. I ran blindly through the garden, plants whipping at my face and body, roots rising from the ground to trip me. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Blackwood shrieking in a language I didn't recognize. Her voice no longer human, but a high-pitched wail that made my ears hurt. I reached the fence and scrambled over it, tearing my clothes and skin on the sharp spikes. As I hit the ground on the other side, I looked back to see Mrs. Blackwood standing at the garden gate, her form shifting and distorting in ways that defied natural law. For a moment, I glimpsed what she truly was. Not an old woman at all, but something ancient and vegetable and hungry, wearing a human shape like an ill-fitting costume. I ran toward my house, now engulfed in flame. Fire trucks were arriving, and neighbors stood on their lawns in night clothes, watching in horror. I screamed for my family, trying to get to the front door, but firefighters held me back. Through the windows, I could see the peace lily, now grown to monstrous proportions, its tendrils extending throughout the house like an invasive root system. As the flames consumed it, the plant emitted a scream that perfectly matched the one still coming from Mrs. Blackwood's garden. I lost consciousness then, overcome by smoke inhalation and shock. When I woke up in the hospital 2 days later, I learned the awful truth. My parents had died in the fire, trapped in their bedroom by what fire investigators called an unusual growth of plant material that had somehow blocked their door. Emma wasn't found in the house. According to firefighters, there was no evidence she had been home when the fire started. A search of the neighborhood found no trace of her or of Mrs. Blackwood. The Victorian house next door was empty, appearing to have been abandoned for years with no furniture or personal belongings inside. The garden too had transformed overnight, becoming an overgrown but ordinary backyard with no sign of the exotic plants or the mother tree I had seen. No one believed my story. The authorities concluded that Emma had been taken by Miss Blackwood, who they assumed was a disturbed woman who had fixated on my sister. They launched a search but with no clear description. My accounts of a tree-like entity were dismissed as trauma-induced delusions, and no idea where they might have gone. The trail quickly went cold. That was 3 years ago. I've been living with my aunt since then, trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life, but I never stopped searching for Emma. I've researched old folklore about plant deities and forest spirits, tracked reports of missing children near areas with unusual botanical activity, and followed up on sightings of a young girl traveling with an elderly woman, always near places with extensive gardens or old-growth forests. Last month, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a pressed flower I didn't recognize, a vivid green bloom with hints of what looked disturbingly like a human face in its center. With it was a note written in Emma's handwriting, but different, somehow more mature and formal than a 12-year-old's should be. Dear Daniel, I am well and happy. I have become what I was meant to be. Please stop looking for me. What's done cannot be undone, and I am no longer the sister you knew. We flourish and grow. We will meet again when the world is ready to return to the old ways. Until then, beware of what you plant and what you nurture. Not all that grows is benign. With eternal roots, Emma. I keep the note and the flower pressed between the pages of a book, uncertain what to do with them. Sometimes late at night I think I can hear the flower whispering in Emma's voice, telling me secrets about the garden and its plant. And sometimes when I look out my window at the ordinary suburban landscape around my aunt's house, I swear I can see the plants watching me, waiting, their leaves turning slightly to track my movements across the room. The garden is patient. The garden is everywhere. And I fear that one day when I least expect it, the garden will come for me too.